Nadia Bilchik has been around the world. She's spoken, written books. Very sharp lady, very strong advocate for good communication and leadership. And I think you're going to get a lot out of this episode with Nadia Bilchik. I have Nadia Bilchik with me. She's originally from South Africa, and she does a lot of leadership communications. And I'm excited to talk to her today, especially since nuclear power is such a technical realm, and folks like myself get promoted based on our technical abilities, and they find themselves in positions where they have to speak in front of large audiences, and you deal a lot with that. So I don't know the first question to even ask, but how do you approach communications with highly technical, highly complicated industries like ours?
Because, as you mentioned, most nuclear individuals, engineers are very technical. It helps to understand that the way you are perceived, your career is based on three factors: your technical capability, what we call your performance, your image, and your exposure. So think of it as a pie, right? Your ability to present information well, and your ability to present ideas in a succinct, clear way is part of your image. And if you look at individuals who have impressive careers, aspirational careers, they've done very well technically and they're subject matter experts, but they also have a positive image. They're seen as a leader. They're seen as someone who can communicate ideas with clarity. And then there's a third aspect, and that is exposure. They have relationships with individuals outside of their immediate silo. So think of performance, image, and exposure. And communication skills are such a fundamental, foundational aspects of your overall image. Am I seen as a leader? Am I seen as somebody who can inspire a team, motivate a team, and build connections and build trust? So that's the three aspects that we look at when we look at your overall leadership presence.
Yeah. So I suspect feedback is a huge piece of what you do for folks, and watching them and giving them feedback. How do you take them on that journey to open up their mind and maybe shift their mindset around communication? What's your process?
So the first thing, Bill, is around self-awareness. If we are going to improve, if we are going to master new skills, we have to develop a greater sense of self-awareness. So the first thing is to learn to monitor yourself and observe yourself communicating. So you can't go into a presentation. And when I talk about presentation, I think about anytime you're communicating with someone other than yourself. So interaction, start observing yourself. Say, is the person I'm speaking to engaged? Is my audience listening? Are the individuals I'm trying to inspire motivated by what I say? So we begin the process through self-awareness. And I do a very simple exercise to increase self-awareness, and that is this. I want you to think about 5 words or images or experiences you would like to have come to mind when people think about you. So it's the first step. So if you think that a brand for a product or a company is like a reputation for a person, when we think of you, what is your brand? What is your reputation? In other words, what words, images, and experiences come to mind when we think about you? And that may not be something you've ever thought of before. So that's step 1. Step 2 is to say, what experiences am I providing to reinforce how I want to be perceived? I can't say, I want to be seen as an inspirational leader. I want to be seen as trustworthy, but I'm not providing the experiences. So step 2 is to say, when I think about my interactions, when I think about how I come across, is the way I am interacting with others in harmony with the overall way I want to be perceived? So the process begins with self-awareness.
Yeah, that's awesome. I was thinking about, as you were talking, you really have to focus on the perception that you're giving people. And I remember being in many experiences with senior leadership, and they started out great, but they couldn't stop themselves from going on and adding more. And how do you teach people to kind of shorten that message to maintain an audience? I think that's a critical piece of what I've seen.
And especially when you're a very analytical individual and you're very detail orientated, you feel that the audience needs to have all the detail. So what we do in my sessions is we start with a simple exercise saying, for any communication, any presentation, say to yourself, who is my audience? What I want them to think, feel, and do as a result of this communication. And then there's a caveat. What's the benefit to them if they take my advice or guidance? Then, when you're crafting your message, you say, is what I'm sharing relevant to them? It's not about me giving you mountains and mountains of information. It's what do you need to know in order to be persuaded, convinced, inspired, or take action? So we go down to the essentials of what you need to know. And then you could always give additional information in a handout or another document or a follow-up session.
Gotcha. Yeah, I remember when we went through our knowledge transfer process at IMPO, and they hand us a little bucket, a little metal bucket to remind ourselves that each interaction should be small. It shouldn't try to overwhelm people with, oh, look how smart I am, or look at all these different areas I can talk to you about. And I go back to my own experience around that and watching people's faces start to go blank and that blank stare. And it really threw me off initially. But understanding those concepts, I think, would really have helped me as I was developing those skills.
And great that you have that self-awareness, and great that you now realize how important it is that you are the messenger of the information. And we so often err on the side of feeling that people have got to hear everything. They don't. Because as you said, it's a small bucket. And the famous analogy we use in presentation skills is you can't make people drink from a fire hose. It's too much.
Yeah.
So we pare it down with you as the audience in mind, with the essentials. And also the spoken word is so different to the written word. Because when we speak, we can use our voice to emphasize certain concepts. If we're saying there is a huge increase in, so we know in the nuclear world right now with the AI demands, there's a huge increase in demand for energy. So I don't need to say so much because I can use my voice to say there's a huge increase in demand. Do you see how my voice is acting as a highlighter? And by slowing down and pausing and using verbal and nonverbal techniques, I can communicate in a much more interesting way. Now, when it's the written word, the words have to be the what and the how. But when we speak, our facial expression, gesture, vocal inflection can fill in for so much. And so in my classes and workshops and keynotes, we look at powerful presentation skills and powerful communication skills, both in terms of what you say, but don't underestimate, and what am I going to say, Bill, that?
How you say it.
How you say it. And that's something that when you've been trained in a very technical area, you're very aware of the knowledge and the technicalities and the facts, and you may forget the power of nonverbal. And I'm not saying what you say is not important. Of course it is, but don't underestimate the how. And if we think that we're living in such a technologically obsessed world, people get so much information thrown at them all the time that when you are presenting information or facilitating a meeting or talking to one other person, you have to be more skilled than ever to cut through the clutter of this vast onslaught of information.
Yeah. Now, I love that message. I was thinking as you were talking, talk about facilitation. One of the other challenges I think a lot of our leaders have is how do you give up control to the audience? And giving up control in a way that engages them You don't want to cut them off, but it's a very scary area. It's better to control every word and I'm going to present these things and I got through it and check the box. How do you encourage people in that area, facilitation?
So there's 3 key takeaways here. As the facilitator of a meeting, as the speaker, you want to do 3 things. And the first is most important. You want to invite participation. But you want to invite participation in a way that is controlled because you are the facilitator. So inviting participation is a skill. Maintaining momentum is a skill. You want to start on time, end on time. You don't want to dwell on one person's question. And then you want to be able to manage dissent. So if somebody is hijacking your meeting, you want to be able to very graciously take control. But those 3 things are skills, and inviting participation is such a critical skill, which is you can ask your audience a rhetorical question. You can ask for a show of hands. You can cold call somebody and ask them to answer. You can warm call somebody, which is to say, Bill and I were discussing, Bill, won't you share? But your role is to get people from passive observer into active mode, mentally present mode, and have the deep confidence to know that if somebody attempts to derail you, you have the skill to, and I'm going to use the word again, graciously and kindly steer them. Because what you don't want is to say to somebody, that's not what we were talking about, or you've lost the point. What you want to be able to have the ability to say is, thanks for that. Doesn't mean you agree with them. For the purposes of time, we want to ensure we get through the agenda, but that's something you and I can take offline.
Yeah.
You want to acknowledge the individual because we never want to humiliate anybody. But at the same time, you want to have a plethora of tools, of phrases. For example, somebody asks you a very difficult technical question. You, instead of umming and blowing and I don't know, you can simply say, appreciate that. There are a couple of things I want to check on. I want to make sure I'm giving you the accurate answer. Being terribly comfortable and giving yourself permission, because the fact is, Bill, and you know this, however much of a subject matter expert you are, nobody knows everything. And it's perfectly acceptable to go, appreciate that, let me get back to Bill. That's something that I know Bill has been focusing on. Bill, what do you think? One of the mistakes that leaders make is thinking they've got to know everything. And the power of making other people feel valued, feel intelligent, feel appreciated, feel acknowledged is an really very foundational quality that leaders.
Yeah, I noticed I think we both do the same thing, which is you say something and we refer back to that statement in our next question or whatever. And I think when I first experienced that with someone speaking, it felt like, oh, I'm being heard. I'm being understood. And it, I think, exponentially increases your interaction and your ability to pay attention.
You phrased that so well. You know, when I do a leadership presence program, we talk about you want to make people feel safe, seen, and heard. We want to bring out the best in individuals. If you think of individuals in your life who have motivated, inspired you, galvanized you, they make you feel safe, seen, and heard. And acknowledging other people is as important a part of your leadership presence as you coming across as confident, competent, charismatic.
Yeah, I interviewed a past CEO of IMPO for a project we were working on. And he referred to me, so, oh, that's a great question, Bill. And he said my name, and all those little things made me feel important. And it really upped my game in a way that I hadn't expected or paid attention to before, at least. I want to go.
Excellent. It's an excellent example because in my years of both working in corporate and training, teaching, so often I say people who aren't really skilled leaders feel they've always got to be the best and they've always got to add something and they forget the power of doing what your leader did there.
Yeah, That's a great point. And I notice you have a little bit of an accent. I know you're from South Africa.
Kuberg in the Cape.
Yeah. So you came up through journalism. You've been on TV for a number of years. You came here, you're on CNN. So you came at communication from that end. Now you've built your reputation around helping others to communicate, but also being authentic. And, you were a journalist and reading and having to put together different things. How that journey you're on affected how you interact with folks like me that have a technical up-and-coming presence versus your own man.
That's actually, Bill, how I started. So when I was on television in South Africa, I had a business show, and I would interview people who were off camera. And the minute I got them on camera, they became very stiff and uncomfortable. So I would do some pre-show coaching. And eventually that pre-show coaching turned into OnQ, which is a media presentation skills training school. So I fully understand that for me, the medium of webcam, camera, audience is part of my DNA, and I'm very comfortable with. And most people that I coach, teach, train, that's not where they've spent the last decades of their lives. But in essence, it's understanding that as human beings, we are all communicating every day. And with very technical people, I have a structure. So in my classes, I have structure, and I call the structure being heard, HEARD, because I find with technical people, as long as you give them something that's very logical and concrete, it really works best. So the acronym of being heard, and I do this and cover in all my programs, is the H is how do you immediately engage or hook an audience. And I've got lots of YouTube videos on this if anybody wants to watch it. Then how, as the presenter, so for example, if we're talking about, I'm a thought manager and I'm talking about safety and how important safety is for each and every person. What evidence, so the E of being heard, is what evidence and stories or anecdotes am I telling to reinforce my points? Because as technical and as analytical as you may be, we still receive information more powerfully if it reaches us emotionally and intellectually. So storytelling is very important. So evidence, anecdotes, and then I have a 3-process way of ending a presentation. It's called the reel in. So that's the HEAR part of being heard. And then D is delivery skills. So I find with technical people, as long as there's a checklist and something concrete and a process to follow, there's a structure and a process, people really respond to that. And you'll be amazed. I mean, I've been doing leadership presence coaching for many years now. And first of all, there's an enormous amount of talent and wisdom in the group. And even people who were at first maybe reticent realize that it requires practice and being conscious and being self-aware. And once they actually include these ways of doing things into their day-to-day interactions, we've received remarkable feedback.
Yeah. I love that, giving them structure that applies to them. And it's almost like you're taking them from where they're at versus trying to get them to see the world through your own experiences.
The reality is when you think about it, certainly in PO, we've got people who, former Navy engineers, nuclear engineers. We've got people whose training is in something that is unbelievably technical, very precise, very disciplined. And now we're looking at so-called soft skills, communication skills and interaction. But what's interesting is I always start the sessions by saying, I want you to think of somebody who has been an inspirational leader or somebody who has inspired, motivated, galvanized you. And it's interesting, the individuals that come up, both publicly, personally, and professionally, and then the qualities that these individuals have. And I always remind people that you are now that person for others.
No, that's a great idea. Plus, you're bringing them from that technical world to a more emotional state, which I think is so important. And I was thinking about the word authenticity, so important for leaders. How do you find that balance between being direct and getting your point across and also being authentic, maybe a little vulnerable, so that they see you not only as a technical or whatever kind of leader, but also a human?
And it's so important. And people confuse authenticity with, I need to tell you everything I'm really thinking. No. Authenticity is, do I have your interests at heart? Am I telling you the truth? And do I believe what I'm telling? And once we start with that, we understand that authenticity, which, by the way, was the most Googled word of 2023.
No way.
Not 25, authenticity. But we need to think about, when I'm talking to an audience, do I believe what I'm saying? If I answer a question, am I being truthful? Am I making something up? But authenticity really comes down to, I am connecting with you. I am not pretending to be other, and I have your best interests at heart.
Yeah. That's awesome. And I want to talk a little bit more about your background. So you were over in South Africa. You were there during the apartheid era. You came over in 1997. What did you learn, and how does your background inform what you do today?
Bill, by the way, it's so interesting. I just had an interview with a young South African woman, and we were talking about that. And I said, I wonder if social media had existed when I was living through apartheid South Africa, if apartheid would have lasted as long as it did.
Yeah.
I stood in line voting in the first ever democratic election with 90-year-olds who had never voted before. So how is it informed? When you grow up in such an unjust system that apartheid was, at a time where there was not the level of transparency with media that there is now, it always gives you a heightened, well, certainly for me, of injustice, of what is fair, of seeing people. I do a lot of work around unconscious bias and conscious bias, and I know it's become a politically divisive topic, but the reality is when you grow up like that, you are very conscious of seeing people and respecting people and of living through a period of seeing injustice in action. And one of my favorite things about South Africa is how people greet each other. People greet each other by saying Sawubona in Zulu, literally translates to I see you. And I have learned through the years is it doesn't matter who you are or where you are. The power of seeing someone, really seeing them and greeting them in a way that says, I acknowledge you, I see you, is very powerful. I also am always aware of the miracle that is South Africa and the miracle that is Nelson Mandela. Because Nelson Mandela as a leader, remember, before the 1994 elections when he became president, there was huge divide in South Africa. There could have been a civil war. And because of his leadership presence, because of his rhetoric, he brought South Africa together in what is now known as a rainbow nation. But I saw the power of brilliant leadership firsthand.
Yeah, that reconciliation committee I thought was a brilliant stroke by him. Why don't you explain a little bit how that worked and how that influenced the future of South Africa?
Well, the Truth and Reconciliation Committee began because there was so much anger and so much pain about past injustices, and apartheid was enforced when Mandela became president. It wasn't like land was given to people or there were reparations. So what they did was a Truth and Reconciliation Committee, which allowed people to vent and to talk about some of the pain they'd endured, some of the injustices they'd endured. And it gave the perpetrators an opportunity to apologize. So more than being something legal, it was cathartic. It was an acknowledgement of your pain, an acknowledgement of the injustices that you had experienced. And from there, a certain amount of healing could begin. There's still a profound sense that the apartheid regime has left a legacy of injustice. But that is an entire topic for another time. But certainly, country that we look at in terms of leadership and healing and moving forward is exemplary.
Yeah. And I know you're very passionate about women in leadership. And for the women that might hear this podcast, how do you approach them maybe differently, or how do you get them to consider things? I know I read somewhere where if women don't meet like 100% of the job requirements, they won't put in for a job, versus men, it's like 60%. Close enough, I'll put in for it. But that's just one example of the difference between men and women. And especially in our industry, I do think we need a lot more diversity. So how do you approach your communication and helping them in communication with women?
So I wrote a book called Own Your Space, A Woman's Guide to Polished Poise and Empowerment. And really with women, the first chapter is around owning your headspace. It's really giving yourself permission. Because what we see historically, and the research shows that typically, and I'm not saying all women, we have many women in nuclear very successful and don't fit this prescription, but sometimes women feel they don't deserve, they don't have the right, which is where that study came from, which was men who maybe had 20% of the capabilities of a job would say, yes, I can fill in the other 80, whereas women would go, oh no, I can't. So it's really owning your headspace and giving women permission to say, I deserve this. I deserve famous seat at the table.
And when you meet with them, and I'm sure there's very competent women out there that are hesitant, how do you approach that scenario? Is it the same as men, or is it slightly different?
One of the things for women is to acknowledge how you were raised. So some women, and depending on your culture, some women were raised, you can be anything you want to be. Some women were raised, you are a woman, you need to be seen and not heard, you need to be sweet and kind and dutiful. And that can also be a cultural thing. So the first thing is to acknowledge the culture. So for example, when I work in South Africa is a very patriarchal society. So particularly if you're a woman, and then if you're a woman of color, you tend to feel intimidated. If there's a man, you should, whether you are conscious of not. So the first thing, Bill, is to be conscious of what is my neuroassociation, what does my brain associate, how was I raised? That's the first thing. And then I have a technique that I share with all audiences, men and women, who maybe feel so-called imposter syndrome or lack confidence, and that is to develop a positive emotional memory database. And what that is, Bill, is a series of all your accomplishments. Because so often, and I'm not saying women more than men, so often the brain focuses on what we don't know and what we haven't done. So I say positive thoughts and positive self-thoughts very often is just like Teflon, whereas negative thoughts is like Velcro. And part of confidence is to reflect on all the things you've done and to let success vibrate within you, and then develop a new neural pathway that allows you to think of those things, which is often counterintuitive.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great point too. What are, like, if you were to summarize a leader that you're in a first level leadership position, you hope to move up if things work out, but you shifted from a technical job to now you're in a people job, people-focused job. And to me, what you described seems very complicated. People are complicated, equipment's easier to deal with. So what are some easy ways to kind of get started, maybe 3 or 4 that come off the top of your head, of people that embrace that complexity of people, giving up some control, being more authentic? What are some of the things just to consider?
I'm going to give you 4 tips, and I'm going to create an acronym from them. So if you're listening to this and you want to write down FIRE, the first tip is to be very conscious about how you feel about yourself and the conversations you have with yourself. Okay, because so often we tell ourselves a story. I'm not good enough. Stop. Who said that? So really be in touch with how you feel about yourself. So that's the first part of lighting the fire. The second part of lighting the fire is to show genuine interest in trends, in what's happening. Right now, in order to be a leader, you have to be current, whether it's AI or the latest technology or trends in the industry. You have to know. The R of lighting the fire is relationships. In a world that is obsessed with technology, your ability to nurture existing relationships, as well as build and develop new ones, is critical. It's critical for productivity, for expediting things, getting things done. Think about the people in your orbit who help make things happen for you. Relationships, networking. I've actually just written a new book called Own Your Network, Building High Quality Connections in a Rapidly Changing World.
Awesome.
And the E of lighting the fire, and this has to do with communication. You've got to communicate with a level of energy. Now, I'm not saying you have to walk around like you've just done 15 cups of coffee, but energy is an important part of leadership, of where you're at, of how people perceive you positively. So think about your level of energy. So feel about yourself, show genuine interest in trends, relationships, and energy.
Yeah, that's a great list. You know, as you talk through many of the things you talked about, and I think about social media and LinkedIn, I know you're very active on LinkedIn, but everyone's a brand, as you mentioned, and you really have to think about that. Even if you maybe shied away from that, I think, just your posts on LinkedIn really show that you can reach a lot of people. You can learn so many things, but you have to be open to want to change if you want to influence more people.
And the thing about LinkedIn is I say in my info sessions, look, have a good current LinkedIn profile. Because if I Google you, that is your online resume. It doesn't mean you have to be on it for hours a day. But remember, people are coming, you and I are Gen Xers. People are coming into the industry who are Gen Ys, who are millennials, who are Gen Zs. They are going to Google you. And all I ask for people is just be current. And it is, for me, it's a challenge. It's not something that I love doing, but I just say, how do we stay current? And current doesn't have to be obsessed. I certainly don't pour over Facebook for hours or LinkedIn for hours, but I do say, if I have something of value, I will post it. And I do recommend just a good photograph of yourself and a current LinkedIn resume, just so that if people do look you up, that's what they notice.
Yeah. And sad to say, I think there's a lot of people that get judged based on that initial scrub. A young person might think about looking to put in for a job, and they look at the manager and there's no picture, there's no updated stuff. That reflects upon them and their perception because it's so ubiquitous nowadays. You can't just get away. And one of the reasons I started this podcast was there's so little about nuclear leadership out there. There's a lot about nuclear energy, but not about the people aspects. And I think, we learned after 3 Mile Island not to talk too much, but I think the cat is out of the bag in terms of getting the word out and being presented to the world a little bit more. And your message really resonates, I think, with me, but a lot of folks that are thinking about communication.
The leaders that come into my sessions, the caliber of individuals, the desire to learn, the desire to connect is extraordinary. And of course, I think we're at an extraordinary point in time where nuclear energy is in demand. And if we're going to meet that demand, are we leading in the most powerful way?
Yeah. And it's funny, I talked to someone that I just listened to another podcast I had done a few years ago, and it was at Waterford 3. So they had Hurricane Ida come through, wiped out their plant for a little while. So they had people coming in and out. They cooked for them at the plant. The plant manager was on a bullhorn trying to get people motivated. And I asked, what did you learn from that experience? And a lot of them shared that the quality of those relationships before the chaos occurred was a huge effect. Mm-hmm. Like, people didn't come up to me and talk about technical things. They talked about their family. Their house had damage. They wanted someone, a leader they could turn to. And your message, I think, really resonates with me and folks like that, that it's not just about the technical stuff. It's about the people having those strong relationships.
It's everything. I do a lot of speaking around maximize your impact in a rapidly changing world. And whether we are looking at Mary Barra from General Motors, or we're looking at Ingenuity Film at PepsiCo, or we're looking at Sully Sullenberger landing US Airways, or we think about Nelson Mandela, we're thinking about leaders who have the ability to really connect with other people and have other people's best interests at heart. And are we doing that? Because at the end of the day, that's what galvanizes individuals.
Yeah. And on that note, I think you're definitely in that category, Nadia. And I appreciate your time today.
Thank you, Bill.
Yeah, I'm glad we can make this work. Nuclear power is a 24-hour-a-day business, and it's very hard to take that time to develop skills. She talked a lot about different aspects of your communication you can improve, but it's worth it. As you move up, you don't want to get to a place where you have trouble communicating and you're high up in the echelons of a nuclear plant. So take her advice, tackle just a few things at a time to improve your communication skills, and it will really pay dividends for you as you develop as a nuclear leader. This is Bill Nowicki saying thanks for listening.